I want to welcome everybody to Advocating for Yourself or Your Child in a Clinical Trial, brought to you with a collaboration between ICON and SysGrip. Next slide, please. So again, thank you for joining our discussion. We're really pleased that we could bring this to you. Again, it's in collaboration with SysGrip. Next slide, please. So briefly, I'm Dr. Mark Sorrentino. I am the Vice President of the Center for Pediatric Clinical Development here at ICON, and I am also a clinical trial participant, and will be sharing some of my journey with you. I'll turn it over to Joanna.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joanna Perkins. I'm a pediatric hematologist oncologist, and by background was in clinical practice at the Children's Hospital System in Minneapolis and St. Paul for 15 years prior to joining ICON, and I am the Director of Medical Affairs for Hematology Oncology for the Americas. So thanks for being with us today.
So I thought I would start out by sharing a little bit of my journey. Right around Thanksgiving of 2020, I had a small lump in my neck and ended up finding out that I had a head and neck cancer that required surgery as well as radiation and chemotherapy. At the time of my diagnosis, my care team told me that there was a clinical trial that I could participate in. And given that I had been in clinical research for over 20 years, I thought, wow, this is the first time that I have gotten to be a participant in a clinical trial. And I was both nervous and excited about seeing what it would be like on the other side. And what I found overall was that all of us who are in a clinical trial have to be sure to be advocates for ourselves, and in the case of putting a child into a clinical trial, for the child as well. So it really started from the very beginning because I, of course, had to sign a consent. And my team gave me the consent, and the consent was 15 pages long. And I knew that, 15-page consent is not the worst I had seen during my time as a clinical trialist, but it was still fairly overwhelming. And it made me think, oh my gosh, imagine now a 15-page assent that would have to go to a child all the way down to the age of 6. Of course, it was filled with all sorts of legalese. One thing that I picked out that I thought was very challenging was the schedule of assessments. I think anybody that goes into a clinical trial, you should ask what is going to be done to you or your child during the time that they're in the clinical trial. And that's what the schedule assessment should show you. And in my consent, that was written out in a text form. There was no table where I could see that, okay, on day 15, I was going to have an MRI. And I thought that that was really a challenge to get through. So I actually asked them for the schedule assessments out of the protocol. But again, had I not been a clinical researcher, I never would have known to do that. And I got it in a table form, and I thought it was much easier to see. So, Joanna, I don't know what you've seen in the past and seeing those in protocols, but I found that was really challenging.
Yeah, I agree. Those consents can be completely overwhelming. And, obviously from a regulatory standpoint, there's a lot of information that has to be included in there. But one of the things with the schedule of assessments that I think is really important that people understand clearly, and it's not always obvious from the consent, is what is being done for the study that is additional to what would ordinarily be done for standard of care. So for example, you may read that consent and see that there's a weekly blood draw and feel that that's overwhelming, but what you wouldn't understand is that there would be a weekly blood draw, as part of your regular standard of care treatment. So it's really important to understand with that schedule of assessments, what is being done that is above and beyond the standard of care, and specifically only for that study, that clinical trial.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and such a great segue, because something very similar happened to me a couple of times. Actually, it wasn't even just once, but one time I went in for my standard of care blood draw, which was in one laboratory area in the hospital. And when I went to the clinic to do my schedule assessments for that day for the trial, they came over to draw blood from me. And they did draw it, in fact. And I said to the study coordinator, hey, I just had my blood drawn over, at the other clinic. Why are they not talking to each other? Why couldn't I have only been stuck once? And look, we know with children, painful procedures is something that we try to do a good job of reducing. And yet here was a perfect example where, the teams weren't talking to each other, and I ended up getting stuck. And I know, Joanna, you have some comments on that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And depending on the trial that you're in and the center that you're at, it may be two totally different teams of people that are overseeing, number one, your clinical care, and number two, your study assessments. So it's really important to advocate for yourself, for your child, to, just make a point of understanding what is being done on each of the days that you go for your visit. And I'm glad you mentioned painful procedures too, because particularly for those who have children that are enrolling in clinical trials, or, just standard of care, painful procedures are often a part of care and trials, and certainly lab draws are. And so it's really important, particularly for children, to make a point of understanding, asking questions about what will be done to support your child through those painful procedures, or adults as well. But in my experience, for children, many centers have, dedicated child life staff that's their full-time job, is ensuring that children are cared for in the most sensitive way, and that anything scary or painful, that they're there to support with distraction, with sedation, with other, play techniques, as well as, often centers have actually dedicated pediatric psychologists that are there as part of that care team as well, to try to minimize any fear or any pain for the child. So really important for parents to be able to ask questions about that. How will my child be supported through these procedures?
Yeah. I found even scheduling my visits was kind of interesting. Obviously, if you're in a clinical trial, or your child is in a clinical trial, there are things that are done on very specific days. That said, I found one time where I was going in 1 week for my standard of care visits, and the next week I was going in for my visits regarding the trial. And the hospital, it's only about an hour away. I'm quite lucky that it's not that far. But I thought, oh my gosh, this is just silly. Like, why am I going 2 weeks in a row when I could have all the appointments on one day? And then I thought that broader, if I was a parent and having to deal with a child, and now it's during the school year, and now I'm going to have to take the child out of school 2 weeks in a row rather than one. Oh, and by the way, that child has two siblings, and now I'm going to have to arrange for whatever it is with those siblings, whether it's going to a friend's house, going to childcare. And so, it's another example of make sure that you're advocating for your child, and to take a really good look at when you have to be at the clinic. And it's also a good segue into, remote capabilities. I was able to have one of my lab draws done early on in the study where they actually came out to my house. And the nurse did it. In fact, she did it outside because we're in the middle of the COVID restrictions here in Los Angeles. But it was fantastic. It kept me from having to go down to the hospital. She did my vitals, did my lab work. Even one time felt like it was fantastic for not having to go. And there are certainly, every day we in this industry have more and more remote capabilities where we can do pieces of the trial at a distance, so that you as the participant, or your child as the participant, might not have to go in. We do a lot of patient outcomes surveys. Many of those can be done on even a handheld device, right? Like an iPad, and again, saving the family from having to go into the site.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also, you mentioned siblings. That's a really important point. there are often at most large pediatric centers, sibling play area, for example. Unfortunately with COVID, a lot of those things are under limitation right now, but there are even, many centers have formal programs for siblings and how to cope with life when your brother or sister is going through treatment for a chronic illness like cancer. And so that's another thing parents should advocate for is asking, what programs do you have to support my other children? There's often availability for even just something as simple as financial support for, like you mentioned, care of the child or transportation, that sort of thing. So siblings are often, can be sort of forgotten in the whole process because, of course, appropriately parents attention turns to what they're going to do to get their child through treatment for, in this case, cancer. So it is really an important point to mention, to make sure as part of your advocacy for your child that you're also asking questions about what programs are available for siblings.
Yeah, I mean, the great news, if you are a parent or a caregiver putting a child into a study and they are it is being run out of a children's hospital, that they're light years ahead of the adult world, right? As far as those types of accommodations go. Even the painful procedures, I mean, they're just the pediatric centers are really focused on that. I think you just have to advocate and make sure that you're getting that stuff for your child. And one other thing that I thought about when I was actually looking at the consent form that I was going through was just to mention placebo. I think that probably more people understand placebo now that so many people are aware of the COVID trials. But it is a reminder that, look, your child may end up on a placebo, and it might be a placebo-controlled trial. And questions about, okay, so what happens at the end of the study? Is my child going to be able to get the therapeutic agent, the drug that was being studied at that point in time? Or is there a crossover arm during the trial or in a long-term follow-up where they can get where the patients or the study participants have been unblinded and now they know who got what, and those that were on a placebo could be switched to the active drug. So many times that is the case, and I think you just have to remember to ask it. The good news is oftentimes it's not one patient gets the drug and one patient gets the placebo. Many times it's 4 of the children in this case would get the active drug compared to 1 that would get the placebo. But again, if you're the one that got the placebo and you find that out at the end of the trial, I think that it's imperative to ask, what are going to be the options at that point in time?
Yeah, I would agree. And also, you mentioned finding out the results. That's an important question to ask in the beginning, because it may not be the case that, you're going to find out any results, and it may be the case that you're going to get a summary of what the results are at the end of the trial. So that's an important question to ask. We're talking about all these points for advocating when you are considering participating in a clinical trial, but I did want to ask your overall impression and how you felt, because most people generally do have a very positive experience. So what was your experience with that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, that's great, Joanna. It has been a good experience overall. The study staff has been fantastic. And I think that I'm coming away with, very positive feeling in general about being in the clinical trial and volunteering to be in the clinical trial. And it is a reminder that, look, the clinical trials need you, and they need your children. If we're going to get new and innovative therapies for children, which is what we want to do, because children have lagged behind in that in the past. We need to get people into trials, get their children into clinical trials. And I do believe that they can provide a positive experience. And I think that one of the things that I like, that I think most people that are in a clinical trial like, is that, look, I'm looked after by a whole nother team of people. And so they're watching my disease. I'm having extra visits. I really feel like, yes, this whole care team is really on top of my diagnosis and on top of my journey. And I think that that's really given me a positive feeling throughout.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I just want to reemphasize that we really encourage people to participate in clinical trials. And for pediatric cancer is an excellent example of this because the overall cure rate for children's cancer in the 1960s was about 20%, and now today is higher than 80%. And the biggest, most important reason for that is the sharing of data and participation in clinical trials. When you're dealing with rare diseases, you don't advance very quickly if one center is treating one way and another center is treating another way. But with standardized clinical trials where you're all presenting treatment in the same way, we can learn much more quickly how to optimize care and increase survival rates for diseases like cancer.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your story.
Yeah, and thank everybody who participated and watched the webinar. If you have more questions about clinical research topics, please visit CISCRP's website. They have all sorts of videos and great information about joining a clinical trial on their website.
Yes, and I also wanted to just stress that you can keep track of upcoming webinars. So there's another flash webinar sponsored by ICON on Wednesday, October 20th at noon Eastern, and that is supporting caregivers in clinical research and navigating the pandemic. And that will be hosted by our Senior Vice President at ICON of Scientific Affairs and Therapeutic Expertise, Scott Schliebner. So we hope you'll consider joining for that. And finally, just want to again thank everyone for being with us today. Thank you for your time.